Hi everyone, welcome to Java Techie. Today we'll dive into part 4 of our in-depth Spring Boot interview QA series. But before we get started, if you have not checked out previous videos, then be sure to do that for a solid foundation. Okay, so without any further delay, let's get started. So let's begin with our first question, that is, have you worked on RESTful web services? If yes, what all HTTP methods have you used in your project? So there are different type of HTTP method like post, put, get, patch and delete, and each HTTP method serve a specific purpose in web development. For example, if you want to create any resource on the server, you can use this post HTTP method. You can use the put if you want to update something on the resource. If you want to retrieve the information from the resource, you can use this get HTTP method. Similarly, if you want to update partially, then you can use patch HTTP method. And if you want to remove the resource from the server, then you can use the delete HTTP method. So there are many more HTTP methods available in the web development, but these five are hugely used in industry. Okay, post, put, get, patch and delete for different operation. Now let's move to the next question, that is, how can you specify the HTTP method type for your REST endpoint? So before specifying the HTTP method like post, put, get, patch and delete, first you should know what action you want to perform in your endpoint. Whether you want to create something or you want to update something or you want to remove or you want to retrieve. First you should know the action what you want to perform. Based on that, you can define the annotation given by the Spring framework. So let me walk you through different annotation for different HTTP method. Let's go to the ID and let me go through any of the controller class. Then simply I'll just write a method. Now once you define the method, next you need to identify what action you are going to perform. Whether you want to retrieve something from the server or you want to update or if you want to insert. Based on that, you need to choose the correct HTTP method specific annotation. For example, if I want to retrieve something, I can define get mapping. Okay, and if you observe, this annotation itself self-explanatory, that what action you are going to use in this method. Okay, get means retrieve. Similarly, if you want to perform something insert operation kind of thing, or if you want to insert something to the server, you can use post mapping. Fine. Similarly, for update you can use put mapping. For partial update you can use patch mapping, and for removal the resource from the server you can use delete mapping. Fine. And in case of this post and put, make sure to define the request body. Let's say I want to pass some object which is nothing my input. I need to define @request body here. Fine. In case of get and delete mapping, you can define the input as part of URL itself, either using path variable or using request parameter. I will come to that point. Okay, so get and delete, you must need to pass the input as part of the request URL, but in case of post put, you can pass the object as a request body. Along with that, if you want to pass the input as part of request URL, you can do that. Okay, no, there is no convention to follow, but in case of post and put, if you want, you can pass the request as part of the URL itself, but get mapping, you must need to pass the input as part of the request URL. Okay, so this is how you can define HTTP method specific annotation. And if you observe, each and every annotation extends from request mapping. Okay, so this request mapping is the parent annotation for all the HTTP method specific annotation. Because in earlier Spring Boot version, people do use @request mapping instead of different type of HTTP method specific annotation. Let me show you. Let's say I want to use this request mapping. and you need to define the URL users. Okay, so that you need to define as part of value. Then you need to define here which kind of HTTP method is this. If you observe, there is something called request method. Okay, so you can define method. Which type of method is this? HTTP method dot which kind of action you want to perform. Let's say get, you can define like this. Okay, if you want to perform post, you can define like this. Rather than doing this, or rather than specify it manually, Spring provided the updated annotations. You can directly just define the action as part of the annotation itself. Okay, you no need to explicitly define the method type, just play with the corresponding annotation. Okay, so that is the reason this request mapping is the parent interface or parent annotation for all the individual HTTP method. Okay, so let me remove this. Fine. Now let's move to the next one, that is to check your proficiency in HTTP methods and best practices for RESTful web services. Interviewer may present you a couple of scenario based questions. For example, let's consider a scenario. Can you design a REST endpoint? Assume that you have a product database and your task is to create an API to filter a list of products by product type. Basically, you need to write a endpoint where you can pass the product type as a input. Based on this product type, it will filter from your DB the list of product object. Okay, based on the product type, you need to filter list of product from the DB. That is what the REST endpoint you need to design. So let's do it from the scratch. I'll go to the IntelliJ IDEA. Let's go to the why there is error. Okay, we'll just comment it out. Just go to the product controller. So to make our job simple, I have just defined a product service where I have just hard coded couple of object name, and this is what the product type: electronics, education, baby and kids. Like that, I have just specified the hard coded list of product. Now here you need to write a endpoint from the scratch to filter list of product by product type. So first step, you just need to define the method public response entity. Then just define something like get products. Then just define the input based on what you want to filter, that is product type. Now you can simply call service dot get product by type and give the product type. Okay, so the in this get product by type there is no complex logic. This is very simple. What I am doing here, just getting the list of product and just filter based on the product type, and I am just returning the list of object. This is what the simple Java filter condition I have written here. Okay, and I have hard coded the list of product here. It's just for the demo. I just hard coded the value. Just define what it is returning, list of product. And now you need to define return response entity. The status code should be okay, and just define the result. Now the main key part what interviewer want to look from you is that how you are playing with the annotation. Now if you observe in this scenario, we want to perform the retrieve operation. We want to give the input and we want to retrieve the response from the server. So I need to use the get mapping. I can define the URL here. Okay, slash products, let's say search, something like that. Then what is the input you want to pass, that is product type. This is the value. Based on that I want to filter. Now how you can pass this input? You can pass as part of the request URL. So there is an annotation called path variable. This will pass as part of the request URL. Just define this and give the correct name what you want to pass as part of the input. Okay, so this is what you need to write. So here interviewer don't care about how you are writing the logic. Rather he will just look into the approach, how you have defined the annotation and how you are giving the input to the endpoint. That is what the key aspect what interviewer was looking from you. Okay, Now let's quickly test this particular endpoint. Let me start the server. Just go to the browser, type localhost or just define 8181. Okay, then URL is products slash search. Now you need to pass the input, right? Input is what? The product type. Let's say I'm just defining electronics. I'll just enter. I'm getting only two object. Can you see here? Mobile phone and the keyboard with this price, and these were the model. Based on the filter condition what we are giving, we are able to get the result. Now let me try for different filter condition. Product service, let's say education. We are only getting single object because in our DV, I mean the hard coded list what we have defined, we have only a single object of this particular product type. Okay, this is how you can define the filter condition using get HTTP method, and this is what the piece of code you can just write. Now let's move to the next one. Let's discuss another scenario. You need to design an endpoint in a way that it will take the input as a product type. If the user provides this input, the endpoint should filter product based on the specific condition. If user is not giving that input, then it should return all the object. Okay, so for example, in the previous scenario, we have just given the product type and we got the result. But what if user is not giving any input? Then in that case, I want to return list of product available in my DV. The whole list of product I want to display to the user. If user is giving the input, well and good, I just need to filter based on that. If not, I can simply fetch all the record and can display to the user. So this is what something you need to design. Okay, so again, this will prove about your HTTP methods, how you understand it, and how you will play with the annotations, and what are the best practices you are following. Okay, so let's go to the ID. We'll quickly design the same scenario. So just define a method public who will return response entity. I'll write a method find products. Then what input we need to pass? We need to pass the product type as a input. If user is giving this value, then we will filter, otherwise we will return all the product available in the DV. So to pass that value, first we understand, okay, we are going to perform the retrieve operation. So I'll just define get mapping. I'll just define filter slash. I need to pass this input. How I want to pass? With different approach. I don't want to use the path variable. I want to use @request param. Okay, and you need to tell to this request param what is the input. This is my input. So you want to make it mandatory or you want to make it optional, so you can also do that. Just define the value and you can define is it really required. I mean, if you specify required equal to true, then you must need to pass that value. If you don't, then required false, because that is what our scenario, right? If user is not giving this, then I want to return list of product object. So that is the reason I will keep required as a false, which will be act as a optional. Okay, now we pass the value. Next, I'll just do something. I'll check if, I can use the ternary operator product type equal to null, or if it is not null, service dot get product by type using product type, or else just return all the products. Fine, what it will return? List of product. Now finally, I'll just break it down. Then I'll just return response entity dot OK and give the result, which is product list. So this is very simple, right? We are just giving the input product type and we are just validating. If the value not null, filter it, otherwise just return all the value from the DV. Now let's quickly test this out. Just restarted the server. So it started. Just go to the browser I will copy this, I will paste it here, filter. Then what is the input we need to pass? If you are using the request param, make sure to just append the question mark as part of the URL, then define what value you want to pass, that is product type, and which is nothing education. Okay, just enter it. We are getting one result here. Can you see here? Now if I'll give the electronics, let me go to the service, I will copy the exact keyword. Now if I'll give electronics, we are getting two objects. Okay, but if I won't give anything, if I will not provide any filter, let's see whether we are getting the result or not. We are getting all the available product. Can you see here? This is what the use case we want to design. Fine. So if you are giving the input, it will filter. If not, you will get all the result. Apart from that, also if you want to keep some default value for your endpoint, you can also do that. Let's say default value. Always I want to filter based on, let's say, electronics. You can also use the default value. If you are not giving, by default it will consider okay, user want to filter based on the electronics. Okay, now let's move to the next question, that is what is the difference between path variable and request parameter. So if you observe in our code, we have used both the approach. So we are given the product type as part of the request URL using path variable. We are using the product type as part of the request URL using request param. Why there are two different approaches? Why can't I achieve everything in a single approach or single annotation, right? So the key difference is that this path variable is mandatory. If you won't give this input, you will get 404. Server will unable to identify the URL or the resource. Okay, if you won't give this particular path variable value. But since we make this product type optional, if you won't give, there will be no issue. So we'll just prove it right away. Just go to the browser. This is the path variable approach, right? If I will not give, what I'm getting here, guys, I'm getting 404. Am I getting 404 here? Correct. But if I am using the request param, if I am not giving it, still I am getting the result because I have just written the code like that. And the main thing, I have mentioned this as a required false, which is nothing optional. So whenever your input is mandatory, you must need to pass that as part of the request URL. Go for path variable. Whenever your input or the request input is optional, you are not forcing user to filter or you are not forcing user to pass that value, then happily go for the request parameter. So if you observe the simple use case, if you open the Flipkart or Myntra home page, until unless you will not filter the product type, it will display different products available, right? All the products availability it will just display, but once you do the filter, it will display only the filtered result, right? So this is one of the best use case to identify the difference between path variable and request param. Fine. Now let's move to the next question, that is why did you use rest controller, why not controller class? That is, why did you use rest controller, why not controller annotation? So if you go to the code, we have defined the controller class with annotation, this one, right? With annotation rest controller. So the question here, why can't I use controller annotation? So basically interviewer wants to know the difference between rest controller and controller annotation. Okay, so I have just created, let me close this. I have created something called controller demo and rest controller demo. Fine. So let me zoom this for you. So here, if you observe in the controller demo class, I have just defined the endpoint slash controller slash welcome and just returning the plain string. Similarly, if you go to the rest controller, here also I have defined rest controller slash welcome as a endpoint and I am just returning the plain string. Okay. So let's try out this both endpoint then we are able to find out the difference between these two annotations. So let me copy this. I'll just duplicate this and I'll just replace it here. Can you see here? It's working, right? Now let me try the other endpoint from the controller demo, that is controller slash welcome. Just go to the browser, just replace it, press enter. We are getting 404. Okay, so why there are difference? Whenever I am just using @REST controller, I can able to see the response. But when I am using the controller, I am not able to see the response. Rather, I am getting 404. So the reason is that if you are annotate @controller and if you have defined the endpoint, then always Spring Framework looking for a HTML or view page for this particular string. Okay, but if you have annotate @REST controller, then it will return anything what you have just defined. In case of controller, it will always expect the return type as a model and view. But here what we are returning? We are returning the plain string. So Spring Framework internally look for this hello as a page, web page, but if he is not found, that is the reason we are getting 404, because there is no page with name hello, right? So to prove that, what I will do, I will just go to the pom.xml. I have just added the time leaf, just uncomment it, update the project, and then I'll go to the resource template. I have just defined the hello.html. I'll just refactor it. Okay, now if I'll run the code, I'll get the response from this hello.html. That is what I am just trying to convince. If you define @controller, it will always expect as a return type model and view. If you don't have that view present with this name, it will simply cry with the 404. Okay, let's run it and we'll quickly verify it. So started, just go to the browser and I'll simply refresh this. Can you see here? Welcome message from the controller. That is what we have just defined in our HTML page. Okay, and the page name begin with hello, so it was able to identify by the view resolver, because the return type, if you have annotated @controller, it should be always expecting as a model and view. Okay, but in case of REST controller, the media type can be anything. You can return any response. Okay, now the question here, can't I return any different data type from this controller class? Should I always return this HTML or some web page? No. You have option. If you want, you can return the string from this particular or any data type from the controller annotation as well. How we can do that? So I'll just write something like message. I'll just return something like welcome to Java Techie. Then I'll just define at the get mapping slash message. Now here I need to specify what is your media type you want to return, what you want to produce from this particular endpoint. I want to, let's say I just want to return media type some plain text plain value. Okay. Next you need to define @response body. Okay, so in this approach you can tell to the Spring, hey, even though I have just defined @controller annotation, still I want to play with the different media type. I have just specified what media type I want to play, and please append that as part of my response body rather than looking for model and view from this particular endpoint. So let's restart to verify it. It started. Just go to the browser, just change it to message. Can you see here? Okay, I have already defined the different endpoint with the message, so I will just rename it to new or greeting message. Fine, just restart it. Just go to the browser and change the endpoint. Welcome to Java Techie. Can you see the result here? We got the response, welcome to Java Techie, right? So if you observe, same thing if I want to achieve from the REST controller, there is no changes required. Whatever the value I want to return, I can able to return different media type. But in case of controller, I need another annotation called @response body. And if I have defined @controller, so that is the reason I am just defining the response body, okay, with the produces. Now if you want to technically try to find out the difference between this controller and REST controller annotation, the first step, controller always expect model and view to be written, but if you want to customize the media type, you need to play with @response body. Now if you will go and check in the REST controller annotation, the REST controller annotation is the combination of @controller and @response body. Can you see here? Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. Whatever you are achieving here using the controller and response body, that is what the combination annotation build for REST controller. Can you see here? Controller and response body. So whatever we are able to do using REST controller, same thing you can do in @controller by combining these two annotation. Okay, so this is what the main difference between controller and REST controller. Fine, let's move to the next one. How can we deserialize a JSON request payload into an object within a Spring controller or within a Spring REST endpoint? Basically, I just want to give the JSON request and I want to convert it to the object. For example, I have this JSON payload with me where it contains a object and having the field book ID, title, publication year, and again this object contains list of authors. Okay, so each author object again contains author ID, name and birth year. So there are two different objects in the authors list. So you need to design your DTO class or request class with the same structure. You need to create the object, then you just need to define these are the attributes. Then you need to define list of author. Then you need to create a author class with these are the attributes. Okay. So I have created a DTO class. Let's go to that. I have this book class with all the field what we observe in the JSON, book ID, title, publication year and list of authors. If we'll go inside author, we have author ID, name and birth year. Okay, can you see here all the field already defined in the request class book and author. But you need to keep a note, the way you have defined the key in this JSON structure, same key you need to define as a variable name. So if you go to the book, I have defined book ID here and I have defined book ID here. If I'll do the type mistake either in the JSON request or in the DTO class, let's say I have just defined book D capital and I am just giving here book with ID D small, then I will get the bad request. So make sure whatever the key you have defined in your JSON, same key should be your variable name. Okay. Now next, this entire JSON structure I want to map to this particular object. That is what I just want to deserialize the JSON string as a payload to this particular object. How we can do that? Very simple. Let me write a method for you. I'll write, let's say, public string. Okay. Now here what I need to take as a input, nothing, the book object. I'll return something. I'm just getting the title and some string and then getting the publication year as a return type. So what annotation I need to define here? I have the input, which is nothing the object. So you must need to use @post mapping or put mapping. Okay, and just define the URL here. Let's say /books. Now the main part, what we need to do, we need to map this JSON object to this particular book object what I have defined in my endpoint. So to do that, there is a straightforward annotation given by Spring framework. Just define request body. Okay, so by using this particular annotation, we are instructing to the Spring to deserialize the incoming JSON request to this particular book object. Okay, so that is the reason you need to give the correct key, whatever we are defining the key, and the variable name should be match. Okay, now let's quickly verify this. Just go to the postman. I'll just give the URL books. Okay, the HTTP method type should be post, and I have this JSON payload. Now let me send the request. Spring in action, new book has been published on year 2022. Fine, this is what the return type we have. Now if you'll do any mistake either in the variable name and in the key, you will get the bad request. Fine, let's move to the next one. That is, can we perform update operation in post HTTP method? If yes, then why do we need put mapping or put HTTP method? The question is very simple. Okay, so let's say I have one class that is demo controller. So here if you observe, I have just defined post mapping and put mapping. In post mapping, I am performing the save operation, or I am just inserting the new resource to the server. In put mapping, I am just updating the existing server, I mean existing resource in the server. Okay, so post I have used here to insert the record. Put I have used here to update the record. Now the question here, can I execute this piece of logic inside the post mapping? Is this possible? If yes, then why there are two different HTTP annotation, post mapping and put mapping? Yes, technically you can perform update operation using the post HTTP method, but doing so would violate the principle of RESTful design. In REST, each HTTP method has a specific purpose and semantic meaning. The use of post is generally to create the resource. However, the use of put is just to update the resource. And the main issue while mixing up these two operations is idempotent nature of HTTP methods. Okay, so let me tell you what is idempotency principle in RESTful web services. Then we'll understand why it's not recommended to perform update operation in the post mapping or insert operation in the put mapping, vice versa. Okay, so let me demonstrate about the idempotency nature. It's very simple statement. On your subsequent action, if the resource is getting modified, then that is not considered as a idempotent. Okay, so here your post method is not idempotent, but put method is idempotent in nature. It means in the post request, if I will subsequently access this particular endpoint, it will always create a new resource. Okay, it will always modify the server. So that is the reason this comes under not idempotent or non idempotent. But in put mapping, on my subsequent request, it will not do anything on my server. It won't modify my resource on the server. So that is the reason it comes under idempotent. So let's validate it quickly. I'll go to the postman body. I have something called name and age. That's it. Okay, so let me repeatedly hit this particular endpoint, then we'll verify in the DV and we'll understand whether it is not idempotent or idempotent. Just send the request one time, two time, three, four, five. Five time I have triggered the same request, which is nothing the post mapping, and five time it create new resource on the server. So if you observe here, five times it created the new resource in my DV. So that is the reason this comes under non-idempotent. But if I'll do the put operation, let me copy this. I'll give the ID 5. I'll change it to put. Let it be. Now if I'll subsequently call this particular endpoint, there is no change on my server, right? If I'll verify in the DV, there is no new resource added. So that is the reason it called as a idempotent. Since we understand post is non-idempotent, and now if we'll execute update logic in the post, then always it will create a new resource rather than update the or modify the existing resource, right? So it's not recommended. Still you have option to handle post method to check if resource not exist, then create, otherwise just update it. Like that you can do the kind of filtration and perform different post and put operation, but again it violates the rest principle. So it's always recommended, if you have insert operation, blindly go with the post mapping. If you have update operation, happily go with the put mapping. Okay, let's move to the next one. That is, can we pass request body in get http method? Let's verify it. In the get http method, can we pass the request body? Let's say if you observe here, this particular endpoint I have defined as a get mapping slash user slash name, and I am just giving the request body as part of this get http method. So is this possible to do? Yes, technically it's possible to include a request body in a get request, but it's not recommended practice, because you should always consider the alternative HTTP method whenever you want to pass the request body. Like you can go for the post or put mapping rather than going with the get mapping with the request body. So get mapping always recommended to pass the input as part of the request URL, either encrypted or decrypted format, that is up to your business, but it's not recommended to use. But if I'll run the code and if I'll trigger this particular endpoint, there will be no error. Let me trigger this. You are getting the result. So again, this is not the recommended way to use request body as part of this get HTTP request, but it will allow you to pass. That's not recommended. Okay, this is one of the interview question. I mean, they will ask you to confuse you, because never you will do this kind of scenario. No one will pass the request body as part of the get. So if you have not done it before, if someone will ask you, then the confusion comes to your mind, right? So this is the straightforward answer. It's not recommended, but it is not forcing us to stop the approach. We can still do that, but it's not recommended. Let's move to the next one. That is, how can we perform content negotiation in REST endpoint? So I want to design my endpoint who can return both JSON and XML or any different type of media type. How we can design the content negotiation approach in our RESTful web services? How I can design my endpoint who can return different media type? That is what something called content negotiation. Okay, so to do that, let's go to the IntelliJ IDEA. I will take any of the existing controller class. Let's go to the product controller. Okay, so let's apply the content negotiation here. So what all data types or media types you want to support for this particular endpoint? I want it to return the JSON. I want it to return the XML as well. Okay, let's do the change. Better, let me copy this. I'll simply return list of product. I'll just remove the URL from here. It can be accessed with the root URL slash products. Fine, just remove this. I'll just return it. That's it. So this particular REST endpoint, I want to enable content negotiation for this. So what all media type I am supporting here? Let me just define. I just want to support produces application slash JSON. Also, I want it to support application.xml. So this particular endpoint will return the JSON and XML based on the user input. So to enable that, go to the pom.xml. You need to enable the XML data binding. So go to the pom.xml and just you need to uncomment the annotation. This one. Jackson will do this kind of stuff for REST, I mean for JSON. But for XML we need some dependency, right? So Jackson data format.xml. Fine. Just update it and go to the application.properties file. Just enable this content negotiation specific key and value. So if you observe, I am just defining Spring MVC content negotiation favor path extension true, parameter true, and the default content type is application/xml. If you are not giving anything, by default it will result you the XML. Okay, that's it. Let me restart the application, but before that we have done the changes on this controller, right? And we are giving the product type as a input. Okay, let's restart it. Just go to this, I mean this one, right? Filter we have added, products, then question mark, what format you want as a response. Just define format equal to JSON. You will get the result in JSON. If you want the result in XML, you will get the result in XML. Can you see here? This is the XML hierarchy, right? The tree hierarchy. But if I'll define the format as a JSON, you will get the result in JSON. Can you see here? This is how you can enable the content negotiation for your REST endpoint for different media type. Here we just play with the JSON and XML, but you can play with different HTTP media type. Okay, let's move to the next one. What all status code you have observed in your application? Okay, this is most frequently asked interview question. Can you please list down list of status code what you have observed in your project? This is what something the interviewer can expect from you. So to answer that, there are different HTTP status who represent the state of response. Okay, so I have listed down couple of status code. 400, which is nothing the bad request. If you are giving, if client expecting something and while accessing it you are giving something wrong input, then you will get bad request, which is nothing 400. Then you will get 404. When you will get this 404, when the URL you are giving that resource is not available. Okay, then you will get the 404. Then 401 is nothing about the authentication error. If you are giving wrong credential to log in to the system, then you will get 401. You will get 403 if your authentication is successful, you have given the correct credential, but you are not authorized to access that particular feature, then we will get 403 authorization error. Okay, next 405. So we will get this 405 as a method not allowed error. So I have defined a, let's say I have defined a REST endpoint with the post HTTP method, and I am trying to access it with the get. For example, this is get, right? I'll try to access using post. I'm getting 405 method not allowed. Okay, so if you will mess with the HTTP method, then definitely you will get this error. Next, 415. Okay, so 415 is nothing unsupported media type. Let's say client needs JSON and you are sending XML, or client needs some additional input and you are not giving that as part of your request, then we'll get 415 unsupported media type. For example, let's go to any of the example. So here I am just giving the JSON because that is how I have designed my endpoint. We'll take the input as a JSON and we'll convert it to the object. But let's say I'm changing the media type here. I'm sending the XML. Okay, whenever my server expecting to be JSON. Okay, now let me send the request. I'm getting 415 unsupported media type. So next one is 500 internal server error. This is a generic error message indicating that the server encountered an unexpected condition that prevented it from fulfilling the request. And this is the common error message usually we observe in our project. Next one is 502 bad gateway. Let's say you have one application which is acting as a upstream and it is unhealthy for some technical fault and you are trying to access it, then you will get 502 bad gateway. Okay, next 200, which indicates okay, the request was successful, the payload in the response will contain the request data. Okay, and next is the 201, means created, the request has been fulfilled and a new resource has been created. That is what the status code indicate about the resource creation. So there are many more HTTP status code, but these are the status code which we frequently observe in our project. Fine, let's move to the next one. How can you customize the status code for your endpoint? So just to understand, right, 200 means status code okay, 201 means status code created. For example, if you observe go to the demo controller. We have just defined a post mapping to create a new resource. And what is the response we are getting? Let's verify it. Let's say this one, right? Body, this one. Send the request. We are getting the status code 200. However, when we trigger this request, it create a resource on my server. So I should return 201 instead of 200, right? I need to return 201. How can I customize that? Very simple. Just go to the endpoint and just define response status. What is the status code you are expecting? You can define created. Okay, I'm expecting this method to be written http status created. If there is any error, you can set http status to the internal server error, which is 500. Okay, let's run it and we'll verify. It's up now. Just go to the postman and let's send the request. Can you observe what is the status code we are getting? 201 created. You can also see the pop-up, right? The request has been fulfilled and resulted in a new resource being created. So this is what you need to follow the best coding practice to just implement the corresponding status code for operation. For example, put. In put also we are just returning 200, right? So here in the put you can return 204, which is nothing, no content. So for example, go to the put, you can define response status no content. Okay, you can define like this. So these are the some basic standard to define your http status. Fine, let's move to the next one. How can you enable cross origin in your project? So first of all, cross origin resource sharing is a security feature implemented by web browser to control web page requests made from one domain to another. So using this cross origin, you can restrict what all host or domain can access your application. For example, let's say I have just defined this endpoint. Okay. Now I want to access this particular endpoint from my Angular application. So I need to allow my Spring Boot, or I need to tell to my Spring Boot, hey, if from the Angular you are getting the request with this particular server, with this particular protocol, then only allow them to access this particular endpoint. That is what you can enable using the cross origin. So the approach is pretty straightforward. Just annotate here @cross origin and then define from which origin you will allow all the requests. Let's say my Angular is running on port HTTP and it's running on host localhost and port number is, let's say, 400 000. Okay, so here I am telling by this particular annotation I am allowing that particular host and port and this particular protocol to allow my backend application. All the endpoint whatever defined in this demo controller can only be accessible from this particular integration. I mean from this particular endpoint. Okay, this is what you can enable the cross origin. So this is not the only way to enable the cross origin. You can also play with Java based configuration. If you will go here, go to the config, cross config I have just defined to save our time. I mean whatever we have just defined, I'm just adding here in a Java based config. Okay, so here if you observe, I have just defined add cross mapping. I have just override this method and I have enabled the mapping for /API/*. Any request coming to this particular pattern must be enable for accessing, and allowed origin I have defined if the request is coming from this particular host and port I will allow. If you want to allow for all, just define the star. And what all method they can allow: get, post, put and delete. If I have any other method which I have not listed here, will not be accessible. Okay, then allowed credential true. I am just telling that okay, the client application can apply the credential as part of the header or as part of the request. Okay, that's fine. Next, the key attribute is max age. Okay, so by defining this dot max age 3600, I am specifying the maximum age in a second of the pre-flight request. When I say pre-flight request, it's just an initial request sent by the browser to check whether the actual request is safe to send or not. Okay, and I have just specified the time to validate this pre-flight request. Okay, so you can play with Java based configuration, or you can simply just define the cross origin annotation, allow for specific port and host or specific protocol, or just allow for all. Okay, that's how you can define the cross origin. Let me comment this for now, and also I will just comment this for now. Now let's move to the next question, that is, how can you upload a file in Spring or Spring Boot? So it's very simple. File is not a raw object. It's not a employee or customer like JSON or raw object. Rather, it is a binary content. So to play with the binary content, Spring or Spring Boot provided a data type called multipart file data type, or you can use the annotation called @multipart file to play with the file upload kind of scenario. For example, let me show you one demo. I have created one controller class file upload. Okay, so if you observe here, I'm taking the file as a input and the type is multipart file. Okay, and then I'm just setting the destination path where I want to store the file which I'm getting from the request file.get original file name, and I'm just returning some messages after the file has been stored to this particular destination path. Just ignore about this piece of code. Our intention to understand how the file upload will work in the Spring. So if you are using this multipart file, then that binary file will be converted to this particular object, and then from this file object you can get the original file name and its bytes and everything you can write wherever you want. Okay, so let me run this. I will enable the time leaf because I have used the controller annotation, and I have just created some HTML page to just define the result. Go to the pom.xml, just enable it, then simply start the server. But before that, let me verify the endpoint get mapping slash. So let me define something like home. Okay, because there could be a default URL with slash as we have defined so many controller. That's fine. Let's restart it for now. Go to the browser, just change it to home. Can you see here file upload example? Choose the file. Let me choose something like Java Techie PNG. Open. Now I need to upload it. File has been uploaded successfully. If I'll go to the desktop and if I'll validate, can you see here the file is just uploaded. This is what we just uploaded, right? You can choose some different file. Let's say I want to upload this one and upload it. Now if you'll observe, the file is uploaded. Okay, so this is how you can work with file upload in Spring Framework just by defining the multipart file. Okay, that is what the key what interviewer can expect from you, how you can upload a file, what data type you can use. So you can simply reply that you can go with the multipart file data type. Fine, let's move to the next question. How do you maintain versioning for your REST API? So basically maintaining versioning for your REST API is crucial to ensure backward compatibility while introducing new features or changes. So there are several approaches to versioning the REST API, and in Spring Boot there are couple of strategies by using you can maintain the versioning for your REST API to support the backward compatibility. Okay, for example, let's say I have designed one application called flight booking kind of scenario, and there I have defined one method, and in future I want to change the implementation on that method which is already in live. Then rather than do the code change on the existing method, I can create a new version of it. Okay, since it is on live, I don't want any trouble or I don't want any bug in the production. Rather I want to create a new version of that same feature. So that is what something called versioning. And how we can maintain that, let me walk you through one example. And there are strategies, let me walk you through all the strategies. Just go to the id. So I have created, okay, let me close everything. I've created a controller class called flight booking controller. Okay, so it's very simple, guys. Okay, so I have written this particular endpoint. I have just written this particular endpoint booking ticket. It will take the input and it will process the actual logic. Then finally it will book your flight ticket. Now assume in future I want to enhance my booking ticket feature. So what you can do, you can write the code here, business logic in the same existing code, and you can redeploy it. But is there any guarantee, even though you have done full testing, is there any guarantee that you might have missed a small corner case which can break your booking ticket particular endpoint in production, right? So we cannot guarantee about that. There could be n number of corner case which might be missed at the time of development. Even the tester was not able to identify that. So rather than taking the risk, always it's safe to maintain the versioning. So just define, okay, this is what the v1 endpoint, and I will define another endpoint called v2, and here you just write the. So in this case, this will be as it is live. People can still able to access with the slash b1 slash book now, and this is something the new version of your booking ticket implementation, right? So I am just giving the example of this, but there are different way you can define the versioning. The first way I have just shown you by just defining the path URI. Okay. Next approach, you can define the versioning as part of the request parameter itself. For example, book ticket versioning with request parameter. You are giving some request object, and in request parameter I am just giving the version. If it is a version 1, then execute this. If it is a version 2, then execute this. In future, if you will come up with the multiple version, then just do the conditional statement to execute that particular logic. Okay, this is what called header versioning. Sorry, this is what called request parameter versioning. Now the next approach is versioning, maintain the versioning based on the header parameter. So in the header you can specify the API version, and again it is kind of the conditional execution. If version equal to 1, then do this. If it is 2, do this. I mean, this is for old, this is for new. If there are any further new enhancement comes, either you can do this version condition or just go with the else approach. Okay, so there are three different approach. You can maintain the versioning based on the path URI, based on the request parameter, okay, this one, and based on the header parameter. So let's verify this. Okay, so I will change it to the new flight booking success. Okay, new flight booking approach or something like that. Okay, now let me restart the server. We'll verify all the possible way to maintain the versioning. So let's trigger this particular endpoint. I'll go to the postman since this is the post request. So the first endpoint v1, I mean which I handle on the URI itself, v1 flight, not here, right, after flight. Send the request. Flight booking successfully completed. This is the, let's assume this is the v1 version 1 of my flight booking feature. Now I have enhanced the 2 version 2, and I am sending the request. New flight booking approach successfully completed. Now I need to pass in the request parameter. I mean, I can play with that request parameter. What is the value? Version. Then version 1 if I will give, it will execute. This is version 1 of the resource. If I will give version 2, it will execute. This is version 2 of the resource. Now next I can pass as part of the header. So we'll try that out. Maintain the version using header parameter. Booking now 2. This is what the endpoint. I no need any request parameter, just remove it. What I need, I just need to maintain this using the header. What is the header key? API version. Just copy this, paste it here as part of the header. This is version 1 of the resource. If I'll change it to the 2, this is version 2 of the resource. This is how you can implement multiple strategy to ensure your backward compatibility using this versioning. Okay, cool. Let's move to the next one. That is, how will you document your REST API? So we are done with the development. I mean, we are done with some critical business development. We have defined couple of REST endpoint. I need to document them somewhere, right? So that I can give it to my client or whoever want to consume my application, or whoever want to test my application, I can share those document to them. So how can I maintain proper documentation of it? How can I define all the HTTP method? What is the input it needs? What is the HTTP method it is being used? And what is the status code? What is the response code? How I can document everything? Okay. So to make our job simple, Spring Boot provided Swagger implementation. Earlier it was Swagger. Now it is called Open API 3. So using this Open API 3 implementation, we can document our REST endpoint, or we can document our all the endpoints with zero code. Okay, let me show you how we can do that. Just go to ID, go to the project, go to the pom.xml. First you need to add this dependency, this one, org.spring.doc Open API starter web MVC UI. You need to add this dependency, then everything will be done behind the scene by Spring Boot itself. So what I'll do, since we started the server, let's go to the browser and I'll just trigger Swagger. I can see the Swagger documentation here. Now whatever the controller we have defined, it contains information about all the controller. It documented correctly. Demo controller, flight booking controller, we have just defined this endpoint, right? B2. REST controller demo, product controller demo, user client controller, and these are the schema. I mean, these are the input we are giving to our endpoint. User details, it contains this input, author, book. I mean, everything is properly documented. So let's try some endpoint. Okay, let me try these users. This is the post request, right? I can try it out from here. So where is the option? Can I edit here? No. Click on try it out and give the value. ID is optional. I'll give the value Basant. Age I'll give something like 35. Now execute this request. We are getting the response 201, which is the status code, and this is where the response body we found. And if you verify in the DB, there the record has been inserted, right? So using this OpenAI, it's not only you can document the endpoint, you can also do the quick testing of your endpoint. Okay, this OpenAPI is the specification of OpenAPI 3 recent version, and if you want to generate the API description, you can simply use, let's say I'll just copy this. Let's say I don't want to go through the documentation, rather I want to share my API description to the user, I mean whoever want to consume it, or some other team. So I'll simply do like this, v3 slash API hyphen, it should be v3. Can you see here? This is what my API description. From this description, you can read, I mean, what is the name of the controller, what is the HTTP method, what is the request body it is accepting, user details, I mean, what is the status code have been configured, everything, whatever you are getting in this user interface, same thing will be converted to this JSON key value. But if you want to download it, just define .yaml, it will download the document for you, api-docs 1.yml. Okay, like this you can document your all the REST endpoint using the Swagger Open API. Now let's move to the next one. That is, how can you hide certain REST endpoints to prevent them from being exposed externally? So if you observe in the Swagger documentation, all the REST endpoint being exposed to this particular interface. Now demo controller, flight booking controller, everything is just published here. For example, I don't want some of my endpoint to be exposed using this documentation. How I can prevent that? So if you'll go here, let's say flight booking controller, I don't want this B1 and B2 to display in the or to expose as a documentation. So how I can do that? For example, let's take this one. So there is a straightforward annotation. You can use hidden. Okay. So if you use this particular annotation, that particular endpoint will not be exposed as a documentation. So for example, let's check some different endpoint. Go to the product controller. I also don't want to expose this. Go to something else, file upload. Okay. These are the three different endpoint I don't want to be exposed as part of my documentation. So how I can do that? We have just used @hidden. And also, if you want to specify what this particular endpoint is doing, if you want to add some short notes, then you can do that. For example, let's say this post/users, right? It is there in demo controller. So here I will just use, let me zoom this for you. I will just use operation, and I can define what operation it is doing. Insert. Okay, you need to define. Okay, this is what the description. That's it. Okay. Now if we'll start the server, we have defined this file upload as a hidden, this particular endpoint, flight booking, this B2, which is the new feature. I have just disabled it, and anything else. Okay, the product controller. Fine. Well, it started. Just go to the browser and I will just refresh it. Now, can you see /v2 in the flight booking controller? Because we have just disabled that, right? In the flight booking controller, this v2, we have just hide it, or we are just forcing it to not expose. Okay, so using this @hidden. Then in product controller, the content negotiation example what we have done, let's verify that that is not there here, right? Only two REST endpoint is visible. Then file upload. Okay, that since it contains only one endpoint, so we mark it as a hidden, so that section is itself is not visible. Okay, all good, right? This is how we can hide your endpoint to be exposed publicly. Let's move to the next one. That is, how will you consume RESTful API? So in Spring Framework, there are multiple approaches. You can consume the RESTful web services. You can use the REST template. You can use the Fain client. You can use the web client. And in the recent Spring Boot 3.2 version, there is an option called Advanced REST Client. Using all the four, you can consume any RESTful web services. Okay. So let me walk you through example of each and every approach to consume the web services. So let's assume I have one endpoint which is kind of mock response, which will give me the mock response. Let's say this is what the JSON placeholder type code com/users. This will give me the list of mock user. Okay, it will give me the 10 user details with field, username, email address, everything. Okay, so I have created corresponding DTO in my project. So we are going to use this particular endpoint to play with REST template, web client, and Fain client. Okay, so how I can consume this particular endpoint, REST endpoint, using REST template? It's very simple. First, let me go to the class where I have defined all the approach. First, you need to define a bean of this REST template. Okay, in your config class, just create a bean of REST template, then just simply auto add it, and you just need to consume that particular endpoint by giving the URL and by telling that what it will return: list of class of type, user response, and what it contains: id, name, username, email address, phone, everything what you can see in the response. I mean, I only want to capture name, username, email. I don't want address. This nested object I don't want. So whatever the field I need, I have just captured as part of the response. Can you see here? And to consume using the REST template, you need to focus on three things. What type of method, HTTP method you are consuming, that you need to keep in your mind. So here if you observe, this is the GET, right? We are just retrieving the response. So I have just defined GET for object. If it is something post, then you can go with the post for object. Okay. And what is the URL and what is the return type. So let me access this particular endpoint who will consume this particular endpoint and will give me the return response. Okay. So what is that? Fetch mock user one. Let's go to the postman, new HTTP. This is what the endpoint, right? I mean, this is what my endpoint from where I am consuming the REST mock user using the REST template. I'm getting the response. Okay. So here we got the mock users from the endpoint. Fine. Now let's move to the next approach, that is Fein client. So this basically Fein client is a declarative web service client developed by Netflix and integrated into the Spring Cloud ecosystem. It simplifies the process of making HTTP requests to a remote service by just creating a proxy for that particular service as a interface. Okay, when I say proxy as a interface, it's very simple. So if you observe, we are just consuming this particular endpoint, right? This is the get endpoint. So I will just define a client endpoint by specifying this is what the URL, and I just need to enable the Fein client. Then everything will be done behind the scene. I just need to call the method rather than again invoking the way we are doing in the REST template. Okay, you don't need to explicitly specify the URL. You just define your own proxy who will create the code at runtime and consume the event for you. I mean, consume the API for you. For example, you can see here, this is very straightforward approach. Now I just converted that particular provider URL as a REST endpoint. I mean, I am just playing with the annotation, nothing else. I have just defined user client and I just want to use the Fein client to consume this particular endpoint. Okay, I mean, this is the parent endpoint and I have just given the name of it and slash users. Okay, so nothing guys, there is nothing to confuse. Let me copy this for you. This is the URL we are going to consume, right? This is the parent URL what I have specified and this is the URL to access that particular endpoint. I have just represent that REST API as a method, as a REST endpoint in my client code. Can you see here? By using this Fein client, there are so many advantages. You can play with the annotation and by default it enable the load balancing, this Fein client. Okay, and at the runtime this Fein generate code at runtime based on the annotated interface. Based on this interface, Fein client generate the code at runtime. This can lead more efficient and type safe code, isn't it? And the testing is so dead easy because whatever the client you have defined, just call that. It's dead easy, right? I'll show you that. And service discovery, Fein integrate with the service discovery mechanism such as Eureka, allowing your application to dynamically discover and communicate with other services in the ecosystem by just this name. Okay, there are so many advantages of using this Fein client. Now wherever you want to use this user client to access this particular endpoint, will connect to this server and get the details. Just inject that. Okay, so we have just injected here user client and simply call the method. See here, it's single line of code. Okay, let me call this particular endpoint user 2. Send the request. We got the response. Let me trigger it again. We got the response. Right now, the next one is web client. So basically this web client is used for reactive programming to achieve asynchronous and non-blocking consumer implementation. You can go for the web client. So it's not recommended to use the web client for traditional implementation code. I mean, whenever you are not using reactive programming, you cannot, I mean, you can use web client, but it's not recommended, because anyway, for the traditional, if you are using web client, you must need to block that request, right? Which does not make any sense to use web client. But if you have something the reactive programming, it's good to go for web client. Let me show you the example of web client. Nothing, just create the bean of web client. I'll show you in the configuration. Simple, just create the bean of web client by defining the base URL. Then just simply use web client. The HTTP method type is get, and this is what the URL to communicate. Retrieve the result, body to flux, user response dot class. Okay, just convert it to the flux, and response collect list dot block. So why I have blocked it? Because this what I have written is the synchronous call. If I will use the reactive programming web flux, I no need to block this. Okay, so here I am just blocking and getting the result, since this is the synchronous call for demonstration purpose. But this is not the recommended way to use the web client. So now if I'll test this, I will get the result. We got the result, right? Let me hit again. So we got the result. So there are many ways. Based on your use case, you need to choose what exact template or what exact implementation I need to use to consume the web services. And the fourth one is advanced REST client. So you can check out my latest video. I will share the link in video description, so that you can play with this advanced REST client. Since I am using the different dependency version, I need to revert it back and I need to add that piece of code. So that is the reason I have not added it, but I have created a separate video for using this advanced REST client. Okay, so that's it for today's video. I will come up with more questions on upcoming season. Until then, enjoy the course and feel free to leave a comment if you have any doubts. That's all about this particular video, guys. Thanks for watching this video. Meet you soon with a new concept.